What's up, people? Back where we left off with our last video, and like I said, in this one I'm going to show you how to make HTTP requests to pull data into your Flutter application. So just a quick backstory, right? Flutter is a really powerful tool, but there's some things that Flutter won't allow you to do right out of the box. Like, it doesn't come built into it, it won't necessarily disallow you to do it. So one of those things is making HTTP requests. Now, to be able to make HTTP requests in your Flutter application, you need to install a plugin. And I'm going to show you how to install plugins in Flutter and exactly what plugins we need. So I'll pull up my browser here and we'll go to pub.dev and we're going to search for a plugin called HTTP. Now click on the HTTP plugin that has 100 rating and it's by dart.dev, I believe. That's the creator. Or is it the Flutter team? No, dart.dev. Fine. Okay, so this is how you make HTTP requests, not necessarily in Flutter alone, but also in Dart, right? And it's a cool little plugin that you're going to install in your Flutter application. To install plugins in your Flutter application, just go to the plugin page, or if you already know how to do this, you can just skip over this. But for noobs, or people who are just new to this, go ahead and go to the Flutter page. And by the way, if I call you a noob, I'm not here to make fun of you. We're all noobs. We're noobs, we're just learning this thing. For me, noobs means new people, or people new to something. Okay, so go to the page and then click on installing. It's going to show you how to install it inside your pubspec.yaml file. That's one of the files that's in the Flutter for application file structure. Go ahead and just copy paste that, or just copy that rather. Go to your pubspec file, you can find it here in your file structure, and just paste it under the dependencies, not dev dependencies, but normal dependencies. I've already done that, and I've already let my Flutter application like restart, so everything is already installed. You're going to see that thing pop up once you save the file. Okay, that's good. After you've done that, just come to the top here and import the HTTP package that you just downloaded as HTTP. Great, now you're going to be able to interact with that plugin. Something else you need to import, I'll let you know later, but for now you don't really need to know it. So let me just show you the quick way that you can run HTTP requests, okay? And we're back here in our stateless widget. Now in our stateless widget, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the app bar and we're going to add a property called actions. And inside the actions, we're going to add a flat button. So actions is what allows you to add buttons up here on top of your app bar. Give it a child, and the child is going to be of type text, and the text is going to be fetch data. Great, and you can see it's popped up there, and you can see it's still highlighted here. There's a warning. What this means is it needs one more mandatory, not mandatory, one more, well, it actually is mandatory, one more mandatory parameter called onPressed. Go ahead and create that, onPressed, and it's going to be a function. This function, we're going to make it call another function outside of the widget or the build function that we're currently in, right? So call fetch data function. Then we're just going to say fetch data. Let's go ahead and create a void or a function that returns nothing. Call it fetch data. Great. And you can see this is now an active button. You can tap on it. Now a quick intro, right? This HTTP plugin allows you to make requests. Now the HTTP requests return a response. These things don't happen instantly, they happen over time, right? So as a result, Flutter is going to return what they call a future. It's like a promise, but they call it a future. Now the cool thing about having a future in Flutter is you're able to basically tell your program to pause as you go executing code, right? Just make sure you have your basics of Dart down as we go in this. I'll teach you a few things, but I'm not really going to focus on the Dart language like I said in my first video in this series. Okay, so to make this function be able to wait for asynchronous functions to be done executing, we're just going to add an async after the parentheses there. We're going to create a variable and we're going to call it response equals to await http.get. And what are we going to get? We are going to get https JSON. Oops, here we go. JSON placeholder type code I believe it's at users. That's exactly what we want. I'll just copy and paste this. My internet seems to be weirded out, or being weird. Fine. We can copy paste that here. Okay. Now, I don't really recommend that you use this variable thing, because this is like it's just any type of variable. You can take a string, an object, any type of thing. I don't really recommend that, because we're not necessarily returning, or this HTTP get doesn't necessarily return just anything. Okay, what it actually returns is called the response in the HTTP class itself, right? And it can tell you, it shows you here, it returns a future of a response. Now, to make sure that we have type checking and we make our variable type safe, we're going to say http.response. Now we're able to work with any functions that are available to us from this variable. To catch errors, some people like to have a catch error there, or if you want to resolve this, since we've used await here, we don't really need to use the .then. I don't like using callback functions that much. I prefer to limit my use of them. So for us to be able to catch errors, I recommend that you get used to writing that. Okay, try catch blocks, very important. Don't spend too much time making all these callback functions. We're going to catch an exception, and we're just going to print that exception out. Okay, we don't really need to do much apart from just printing that. Now let's just go ahead and print the status of our request, or the status of our response. We come here, click fetch data, we see the response is 200, which means it worked, it found the URL. Now let's print the data that comes back. We're going to do response.body, save that, run the function again. You see all that data comes in, and this data, or should I say body, returns a string. But we're not going to use a string necessarily, because we want to loop over all of this data, and to convert this from a string to an actual, or to actual JSON, or to an actual data structure that's relevant to Flutter, we're going to use a function called JSON decode. Okay, JSON decode, if you just type in JSON decode, depending on what language you're using or what IDE you're using, it may suggest that you auto import it from Dart convert. Okay, I'll do that, but you can still go up here and type in Dart convert, right? And come down here, you'll be able to use this JSON decode. We're going to type in response.body. Once we save that, run this again. Now we have an actual data structure that we can loop over and perform actual data structure functions with. We can manipulate this data. It's no longer just a string. Okay, which is great. Now we're going to come to our first hurdle. If we want the data that we fetch here to be usable from our list view down here, we can say that we're going to change the state of our application from having no data to having the contacts data. Now, that keyword right there, the state of our application, tells us that we need to have a stateful widget as opposed to a stateless widget, right? So to convert this widget, the home widget, from a stateless to a stateful widget, go ahead and just copy this section, cut it off. You can just delete that, then type in stf into your IDE, then change the name of the class appropriately, right? Just format that the way you would anything else. Remove that and paste what you had before. You can save and nothing will change, except now you have a stateful widget where you can store the response from this, or the successful response you have from this request we made. Fetch data should still work exactly the same way, and it does. Great. So with a stateful widget, right, what you have is a class that extends stateful widget, and in there it overrides a function called createState. CreateState is going to return a state widget, right? Not a stateful widget, but a state widget. So that widget it returns is called home state. Perfect. Home state extends state, which is great. Now the way stateful widgets work in Flutter is every class variable you make in your state, or in your state widget, is actually part of state. So if you created like a string here called name, and you set it to Richard, this is part of your state, and you can actually manipulate this. If we just commented that out, and every time you click the button we say set state name equals, I don't know, unknown, and we displayed the name instead of the title here. We're just going to add it here real quick, just for demonstration purposes, and we passed in name. Now we have the state Richard, and we press that, it becomes unknown. We can now manipulate the state of our application, which is great. Okay, but we're not necessarily going to do that, so I'm just going to undo all those changes, or all those things I did. Make sure that's back to normal. Okay, now what we need is we need a way to keep or store the response we have from our HTTP request, this list. Okay, take note, because it has that square bracket there, it's a list of contacts or contact objects, right? We're going to come here, make a list called underscore contacts. It doesn't have to be underscore contacts, can be anything else. This is just like a way I like to name my variables. You don't have to do it this way. Save that. Okay, now once we make our HTTP request and it's successful and we convert it into a list, we can just say list temp contacts equals JSON decode our response body. Then we can set the state and say our contact up there is going to be equal to our contacts down here, exactly how we want it to be done, right? You won't be able to see that change, but once we fetch the data, nothing gets printed out, but we now have the contacts data in our state. How do we show that contact data down here? We're going to come back down here in our list view. You see the list view returns a list of widgets, right? And this is a good thing, because this means that we can basically use a list function to manipulate whatever list we have up here to be in the form that we want down here. What does that mean? Let me just comment that out. Okay, we're going to have children, which requires a list of children, and instead of returning a list of children, we're going to say underscore contacts.map. The map function manipulates widgets. We're going to pass in a contact variable, return something like a text for now, right? We'll just call it hello. Now you can see there's an error. First things first, please return, or please give this thing a return type if that's what it's asking you to do, right? Actually, no, you don't have to give the return type. It's not necessarily strictly required for you to do that. I don't actually think this language supports that. But the reason why this error is here, if you highlight the red line here, it's going to tell you that the argument type iteratable text can't be assigned to parameter list widget. So right now, this map returns an iteratable. It does not return a list. So we need a list here for children. To do that, we can convert the iteratable to a list. And now our error is gone. Once we save it, you see a whole bunch of hellos there. Not exactly what we need, so we can simply come back, copy our list tile, paste that here, then just swap it out. Save, and you see we have a whole bunch of stuff that just say person 1, person 1, person 1. Now, if we print each object here, you see we have a whole bunch of objects that have data that we can reference or we can traverse, right? Let's traverse this object in Flutter. Now to traverse objects in Flutter or to reference variables, or actually not variables, to reference properties in Flutter, what you can do is just remove that, and we're going to say contact, open square bracket, then the name of the property you want to use. So if we go to our JSON here, we need to access the name property here. Great. Name. And then we also need the email property down there. So we're going to say contact email. You see, we've been able to fetch the data into our Flutter application, which is really great. I'm happy we've gotten this far. I'm happy you've gotten this far. So now let me show you a few tips and tricks, because this video, well, I just didn't want it to be this alone. It can be something a bit better than this. Let me show you how you can make this fetch data function fire when you open the application or when you open the screen. Okay, what you need to do is you need to override a function called, it's a void function called initState. InitState is going to have super.initState, right? It needs to send this to a super class because we're overriding a function. Great. Now, Inside init state runs every time the application, or it's called when the object is inserted into the tree. What this means is every time the thing comes into view or comes into the actual widget tree, you'll be able to see init state, or init state will actually be able to run. And this is exactly what we need every time our home widget, this big widget, is inserted into the widget tree. This thing here, the widget tree, what we need is this function to run, load this data for us. We don't want to have to press a button at the top there every single time. In fact, let's just go ahead and delete that because that's a terrible application. Gone. What we're going to say is, to protect yourself, you don't want this to fire before the widget is done loading or the widget is mounted. So what you want to do to protect yourself, well, let me just say you can run fetch data right there, and that's perfectly fine. If you refresh the application here, take a look here, it will be blank at first and then it shows up. That's perfectly fine. But if this thing completes quicker than you expected it to complete, or quicker than the app or the phone that you're running on expected it to complete, it's going to throw an error. It's going to tell you that you can't really set state if state is not created yet, right? So to stop that from happening, what you can do is just say if mounted. There's this cool function called mounted that the material class lets you use, right? And it says here whether the state is currently in a tree. Make sure that you only run a function after in init state when the function is in a tree. You don't want to have an error because mounted isn't true, right? So what you're going to do is run fetch data from there. Keep yourself safe, keep the application safe. Refresh the page, and it runs every time you refresh the application or when you open the application. Here's another thing. Let's say somehow, some way, this data was updated from the server, right? And you want to have that updated information, or you want your users to be able to get the updated information without them closing the application or tapping an awkward refresh button up there like it's 1999, you know, before apps were even invented. What you're going to do is implement something, a little cool tool called pull to refresh, right? All the great apps with ListViews have pull to refresh. Let me show you how you can implement pull to refresh in this current application. Now, to implement pull to refresh, what you can do is just delete this part here. You don't need that. Take your list view, right, and wrap it inside the widget called the refresh indicator. Okay, the refresh indicator takes a mandatory child. The other thing it takes is a mandatory function, right? And the function has to be a future void function, right? Look at this really carefully. It has to be of type future void. This way, the function is going to wait for whatever is happening inside here to complete. After that, it's just going to show you the data. On refresh, is going to be fetch data. You can see this fetch data is not type future void, it's just type void. Change that like that. You have a future void function. Okay, now we're able to use our fetch data here. To be able to actually pull to refresh, this is all you need. What you're going to do is pull that down. Once the data is pulled, you're able to pull to refresh. Okay, one last trick up your sleeve. Let's say you don't want to have one of these contacts here and they've pissed you off, you don't like them, and you want to delete them. Coming videos in the future, I'm going to show you how you can delete things from your list views. In fact, let's not wait for, you know, sometime in the future. Let's just delete this information right now if we want to, okay? To do that, there's a couple of ways you can do it. I like to, you know, just hold the thing and delete it, or put a little button up here and then click it to delete. That's the way I'm going to show you. Your list style has a parameter that you can use called trailing. Trailing, you can add an icon button. The icon button requires you to have an icon. The icon has to be an icon widget. Icon, and then inside the icon widget you have to pass in an icon. Icons.delete. I know, really like weird way of doing things, but it's actually not weird. It's actually, you'll find that it's actually one of the most efficient ways of doing things. We save that. You see all the widgets now have a little delete button, which is great. Okay, now we're going to say onPressed. The function for onPressed is going to be delete contact, like that. And inside delete contact, we're going to pass in the ID of the contact contact ID. Great. Let's go ahead and create a function called delete contact, void delete contact with an ID in it. Exactly what we want. Now these buttons are active. To delete that contact, what we're going to do is first we're going to use this ID to find the contact that we're actually tapping on from the state. To do that, we're going to say contacts dot single where, right, find the index. So this single where here is going to return an element. Maybe you don't want to return an element, maybe you just want to return an index, which is what we're going to do. We're going to say contact dot index where actually, and the element and where the element ID is equal to the ID that we passed there, right? Int item index is going to be equals to that, and we're going to print that out just so you know that this function is actually working. Save it. You see, it's the first one. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3. We expect 3. 3 works perfectly fine. Since that works, we're going to say, now here's the thing about changing state, right? Or changing something in state. This is not the way React does it, where state is not necessarily immutable. Here, state can be mutable, right? All you're doing is just replacing a value in state. Actually, in fact, a good practice is to make sure that your state is immutable. Don't change state, replace state. Okay. To do that, what we're going to say is set state contact equals to contact dot remove at item index, right? And the remove at returns what? The removed object, which is not exactly what we want. So what we need is a function called, this actually returns a boolean, no. Just give me a second. That function is called, it's supposed to be a filter function. Surprisingly, I don't remember what that function is called, right? But it's supposed to be a filter function. I like to use a filter function because it's just like a pretty understandable way of doing things. So let's just check and make sure everything is here. Okay, so we're gonna call it remove item index. So I've chosen to make state mutable. Don't do it this way. I've chosen to do it this way, right? Originally what you can do is, or not originally, alternatively what you can do is say, have a list here called temp contacts, and set this to what the actual contacts are. Say temp contacts dot remove at item index. Great. Once that's done, set your contacts equals to temp contacts. Still going to work perfectly fine. Leanne Graham, I hate you. Gone. Perfectly. Okay, we don't like Leanne Graham or whatever her name was. Clementine Bouch, gone. We don't like you. Okay, and that's exactly how you're going to manipulate stuff in your list. I'm going to show you some more stuff with lists in the future, but now this is basically the basics. I know that from what we did up here, you'll be able to add items to the list. I don't really need to walk you through how to add items to the list. You're obviously going to get that done really, really easily. Okay, so great, thanks for watching, and in the next one I'm going to show you how to navigate to different screens in your application. Okay, peace.